I love that Steve has guessed my title. I appreciate that, Steve. So Jeremiah 29:11-12. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. As Steve's already mentioned this morning, it's not news to say that probably most, if not all of us in this fellowship are experiencing quite significant trials at the moment. Whether it be health, finances, family, work, we've all got it going on. And it is a tough place to be. And as humans, I speak for myself entirely in this, but sometimes, I don't know about you, but we can be quite fickle. And I looked up the dictionary definition of fickle, and it said to change frequently without good reason. And I feel like that is me most of the time. Some days I can feel really encouraged and empowered and hopeful for the future. And some days it can feel completely the opposite, for no real reason. Nothing's necessarily really changed, but, the walls can start to feel like they're caving in, and a way forward doesn't always seem like it'll ever be possible. And it's in these moments that my guard is weakened, and I can only speak for myself, but I can start to feel all these negative emotions. Why? Why has this happened? Why has that happened? What is the purpose of this situation? And sometimes it can turn into a vicious cycle. I even start to question maybe where God is. And I often look back and long for the days before, when life was carefree, when the world perhaps didn't feel so intense. Many years ago, I heard a pastor say that it was a sin to look back and wish for the past. And I remember so vividly hearing that as a sort of teenager and being so confused and worried because I had a brilliant childhood. And there were days where I would just long for, the only problem to be how I was going to finish my English homework. I couldn't fathom how that could be a sin. And it's hard sometimes not to wish yourself back, isn't it? Or to live with your head very much in the past. Worry, regret, wishing we could turn back the clock and do things differently. I look back at photos of me a few years ago and I barely recognise myself. And sometimes naturally human nature wants me to go back. We often want to find the easiest and quickest way out of a problem. And rather than going through a trial, we kind of just wish we could bob out of the race. But if we look back, then we're taking our eyes off of where we're headed. And it's quite difficult to walk forwards effectively whilst looking behind. I'd also go as far as to say it's maybe a sign of distrust in God and that he does have a plan for us. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. We're told specifically God has a plan for us, and believe it or not, it is a good one. It can come a bit cliche, I guess, in Christian circles. We band about this sort of idea all the time, but it's true that it doesn't mean that we're going to avoid all difficulties. We know that, don't we? We live that frequently. We all have difficulties, but the word for me, and possibly for someone in here, is to stop being fickle, to stop changing frequently without good reason, to be more steadfast and trust that the best is yet to come. It's difficult to see the bigger picture sometimes when you're standing on one tiny piece of the puzzle. But we do have to trust that every situation has a plan and purpose behind it. If we wish ourselves into the past, or live in the past in that state of regret or sorrow, we're doubting God's plan and missing opportunities in our current situation. This made me think about the Israelites in the wilderness after being freed from slavery in Egypt. And this entire account of the Israelites being released from Egypt has been a real strong theme for me in the last year, in leaving my job and so forth. And God really warned me when I came out of work and started sort of to move forward in possibly a new direction in life, not to look back, and also not to take on any new gods, so to speak. Often we can rely on a career to provide income for us, and that in itself can become a god. Ultimately, we have to trust in the one true God to provide and to be our source of everything. Exodus 16:3, this is from the New Living Translation, and this is obviously the Israelites in the wilderness. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. And I think there's something that goes around on social media every now and then, and it's, when Job was, he wanted to die, and then the Lord said, just eat something and have a sleep, and that kind of solved. And I think so often we're really short-sighted, aren't we? And if our immediate needs aren't met, if we're hungry, if we're tired, if, something's just not going our way that day, we're done. And the Israelites would have gladly given up their freedom again for some pots of meat and bread. I mean, that just, to me, just sums up humankind, really, myself included. They wanted to be back where they knew. Because sometimes the familiar is safe. It's comfortable. Even if it's not very good for us. How often can our own short-sightedness cause us to miss the blessings that actually are all around us? And again, I don't want to be someone who bangs on about my health all the time, but obviously for me, it's where I am. And, coming out of my job and my career and experiencing this bad health has been really hard. And I could choose to focus all of my attention on that. Or, with all my might, I'm trying to focus on, actually, I get to spend a lot of time with my daughter now, and that is so precious. And I get to spend a lot of time with God now because I have a lot of time on my hands. And actually, if we shift our focus from the negative to the positive, then actually we start to realise that although it feels like a wilderness season, there is still so much blessing around us. But I get that's hard. I feel I can speak this because I'm living it. The wilderness wouldn't have been fun, but it was all part of God's plan to lead them forward. They couldn't get from slavery to the promised land without this transition period. And sometimes we face a bit of a wilderness, don't we? But God has a purpose, even when that seems impossible. In that place where we literally have no clue what we are doing sometimes. Unfortunately, we can let the whispers of the enemy have more power over us, and he can tempt us into longing for the past, or he can tempt us to go over and over everything we did wrong, or everything we should have said, or everything we should have done. And that's the enemy, because God's dealt with all that. Whatever mistakes have been made, whatever's happened, that's all at the foot of the cross. In our impatience, sometimes we can stumble and try to choreograph things back to the way they were. But in fact, we are exactly where God has placed us. And like the Israelites, we have lessons to learn along the way. Thinking about people who were looking back and I hope you can see where my trail of thought was going. I was then thinking about Lot's wife. I always feel bad she's called Lot's wife and we don't get her actual name. That's just a side point, but I suppose it could have been worse. I won't read the whole chapter. I'm imagining that most of us know the account. Sodom and Gomorrah were lawless cities, places where sin was rampant, and all the people there were found to be wicked. Lot and his family found mercy through Abraham and were spared from the resulting destruction of the cities. They were led out by 2 angels and told to flee and not look back. Genesis 19:16-17. When he, Lot, hesitated, the men, who were the angels, grabbed his hand and the hands of his daughters, and other translations say wife as well, and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives, don't look back and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will be swept away." And sometimes God frees us from a situation and we are commanded to flee, especially if it's been in a place of sin or disobedience. But if we're not guarding our hearts and spending time in fellowship and seeking the Lord, even that sin can start to become attractive again. Moving just forward a little bit into Genesis 19:24-25. Then the Lord rained down burning sulphur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. There was nothing left. I love how it clarifies that it was not only the people, but it was also the vegetation. It was everything. It was completely destroyed. And God is righteous and holy, and he desires the destruction of sin. And, I think this account is a foreshadowing of Jesus' return and the end of the world. There will be nothing left that is not righteous and covered in the blood of Christ. Verse 26, and I've taken this from the Amplified version just because I liked the extra little bits in brackets. But Lot's wife from behind him, so she was sort of lagging behind, foolishly, longingly looked back towards Sodom in an act of disobedience, and she became a pillar of salt. Lot's wife was longing to be back in a place of sin. She's being disobedient, and there's a consequence for that, a consequence which is quite... it's not normal, is it? It's quite shocking. But so will be the same. Anyone not found in Jesus, anyone longing to save their own life, to follow the ways of the world, will lose it. And that's a hard message, isn't it? Of course, there's a stark difference between me wanting to be back in a place of health and Lot's wife desiring to be back in a place of debauchery. But both desires overlook what God is doing amidst the chaos. This is why we have to have faith and trust. God has spoken, and he said he will never leave us and never forsake us, and he will prosper us. We have to believe it. So, going a bit more into the meat of the message, I'm aware of the time, so I was really struck by the picture in my mind of Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt. And when I looked into this, the word used for pillar was similar to that of a garrison or watchtower. And it just gave this eerie picture of this pillar of salt almost being like an altar to God's righteousness and judgment, looking out over the desecrated cities. Salt is a concept in the Bible that has always intrigued and bewildered me slightly, because I've never quite understood the meaning of us being salt of the earth, or certainly growing up, I just couldn't understand what it meant and how the metaphor can be interpreted. Matthew 5 verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, salt interests me. That's quite a sad statement to make. But we use salt, all of us, and consume it every single day. If I'm on a diet, it says you need to get all your electrolytes, so I'm adding salt to my water and I'm putting salt in my bath, and it has many uses. But what I love about it is that the chemical composition of it never changes. So you can add salt crystals to, say, a boiling pot of stock, and if you boil it right down, you're literally going to be left with the salt crystals. But it doesn't ever really go anywhere by itself. It has to be applied. You have to put it on your chips or put it in your bath, and I think the same is true for us. We're not special. I'm not special because I'm Lucy, but because of who God is. And God dwelling in us and changing us gives us that flavour and definition from the rest of the world. But we can still be salted even if we're not anywhere particular, if that makes sense. So salt is still salt when it's in the shaker, but it's not really doing much. Salt had a number of purposes in the ancient world, and I was sort of researching this, and I would say at least 5 of them are relevant to Jesus's words about us being salt of the earth. So salt was used for flavouring and preserving, which I guess are the obvious ones, but it was also used in sacrifices, in destruction, and in fertilisation. Stay with me. So flavouring. So this is the obvious one. Salt makes food taste better. We either add it to crisps or chips, or we enhance flavours that are already there, like vegetables, or we can even, who likes salted caramel? Yeah. And that provides a contrast, but it's still good. It's a powerful illustration of the way Christians are to serve the world. We're intended to spread through the earth and enhance it and add flavour to things, situations, people that may be bland otherwise. Not in a boring sense, but in a spiritual sense. Drawing out the blessing in whatever is good and providing a contrast by being distinct and different to the culture around us. In Colossians 4:6, Paul tells us to ensure that our speech is seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Number 2, preserving. Salt was the ancient equivalent of the fridge. If you wanted to stop meat or fish from decaying, you could rub it in salt and make it edible for longer. This was the main reason salt was so valuable. And as an aside, Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, which is the origin of the word salary. It was very valuable. Disciples of Jesus in this sense are sent in the world to keep it from decay, preserving its goodness and preventing it, or going some part to preventing it from becoming corrupted or ruined, which is a helpful thing to bear in mind. We are to stand up for what is godly and righteous in this world and shine a light for others to show them the way, which is Jesus. And of course, the verse about salt in Matthew goes on to also compare us to being light of the world. Jesus, of course, being the ultimate source of salt and light, but also living in us. We can take it through the world or through Uttoxeter. The third point is sacrificing. This may well be related to the two previous functions of salt in flavouring and preserving, but it's less familiar to us. And you see, early in Israel's history, Moses explained that sacrifices should be offered with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offerings, and with all your offerings you shall offer salt. As followers of Christ, we are to be living sacrifices to the Lord. Therefore, we must too be salted in order to be pleasing in God's sight. Put a different way, we could live our entire lives thinking we were being sacrificial, but if we're not doing it for God's glory, if we do it like the Pharisees do on the corner of the street for our glory, if we're not shining a light on the path to others and making a difference in the world, then we're saltless and we're not a pleasing sacrifice. If everything we do is not done for the Lord, then it's not a pleasing sacrifice. The fourth one, destroying, and this is not an easy one, but there's more scriptural references apparently to salt being used in judgment or destruction than to any other purpose. As we've read, Lot's wife turned back to look at the city of Sodom and she was turned into a pillar of salt. And Jesus refers to this when describing the day of his coming. In Luke, when Jesus talks of his return, chapter 17:32 simply says, "Remember Lot's wife." Jesus uses what happened to Lot's wife as a warning to us for his return. Jesus again in Mark 9:49-50 says, "Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." Salt in the ancient world was used to express judgment upon evil. And there's a sense in which disciples have the same purpose. The very existence of the church, preaching and living out the gospel, proclaims judgment against the enemies of God and serves as what Paul calls a clear sign to them of their destruction. This may be why Jesus says we're the salt of the earth immediately after describing the persecution we will face if we follow him. Fertilizing, the last one. Several ancient civilizations used salt as a fertilizer for the soil. And depending on the conditions, it could help the earth retain water, make fields easier to plough, release minerals for plants, kill weeds, protect crops from disease, stimulate growth and increase yields. And, Jesus would have been probably talking to quite a lot of people who were familiar with using salt as a fertilizer. So I think this one probably would have resonated with them. Disciples are fertilizers. We are meant to be in those places where conditions are challenging and life is hard and the land may seem barren. We may be sent to enrich the soil, protect against disease and stimulate growth. And as we scatter, life may spring up in unexpected places. Barren land becomes fruitful. As Scott said last week, places where nets have been cast many times before and come up empty shall become heaving. I personally found looking deeper into the meaning of salt of the earth very encouraging. Even on days where I feel useless or have little energy, I can salt myself and live out my day, however uneventful, as a sacrifice for the Lord. I can send an encouraging text to a friend going through a difficult time, or I can pray, I can worship, I can acknowledge the lordship of God. Sometimes when situations seem hard, it may be helpful to remember that we're being used as fertilizer in that place. And without us, with the presence of the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, it would be even more hopeless. So I'm going to close it up now. Those of you who've heard me speak before will know that I have a little penchant for mnemonics. So I like the idea of having something to reflect on throughout the week, because sometimes a sermon can just feel like a whole lot of words. So Steve has very kindly put me the flip chart out. So how do we remain salted? How can we salt ourselves? Now that is a whole entire sermon in itself. And this is more just a bit of a reflective thing rather than sort of the in-depth element of things. But if you bear with me, and I think, this helped me, and I hope it helps you. So we're going to go with... So, very loosely, so now Steve has already said this morning, singing is not necessarily worship, but he's beat me to it because on my sheet I've got sing/worship. And for me, this is one of the things that I can do. Even when you feel rubbish, even when you've got no strength, no energy, you can still worship, whether that be sing or whether that just be living out, your day as the Lord would want. But I always find worship miraculously changes my mood. It changes my heart. It changes, just the whole day, really. And amazingly, obviously most of you know I've got long COVID, and singing has actually been found to be really helpful because it stimulates the vagus nerve, which apparently is damaged in long COVID. So by singing worship to God, I can actually be healing myself. So to sing and worship is to place God, where He's meant to be in our lives. So acknowledge, we can declare who God is and speak life over situations, loved ones, our town, our church. Like Steve said before, Jesus' name is not a magic spell, but it does hold power when we speak it over people and situations. We can live a life of sacrifice, but if it's like the Pharisees who do things for themselves and not God's glory, we lose the salt from our sacrifice. Look and listen. So by that I mean read the Bible, allow God to speak to you. This is how we learn more of God's character and desire for our lives. It educates us on how to think and act in a more salted way as we go into the world and engage with non-believers. And then finally, you'll be pleased to know, Talk to God. Pray to him. What's burdening you? What are you struggling with? What's taking you away from him? What's in your past that's making you, obsess over it and stopping you from moving forward? What do you need? When the Israelites were moaning and wanting to be back in Egypt because they had no food, God then provided them food. So I think, obviously, like I say, this is not a definitive, all-encompassing thing, but I think going forward this week, if we just sort of think about these things and get our minds and our hearts into the right place, into the Word, and in fellowship with God, then we are going to be better sorted going out into the world.